ambassadors, distinguished guests, if I may begin in our own ancient language for just a moment. Hail she is a iama usle iliog to firkin folgerov gudi Áras an Uachtaráin agus ferm firkin folgerov iliog as a gohori at sonata taka dun horna haigin or her lecture lad. It is such a very great pleasure to welcome ambassadors, distinguished guests, to welcome you this afternoon and have the opportunity, as it is, of meeting again with representatives of small island developing states and low-lying coastal states and communities, and thus having the opportunity of building on conversations we have had already in New York last year, of further deepening the bonds between our island nations. And I do want to thank all of you who have travelled to Dublin this afternoon. And as I have just said in our own language, I wish you a hearty welcome, and especially to those for whom it is their first visit to Ireland. It is surely helpful to think of our world as a collection of related communities, of peoples celebrated, of peoples It is surely helpful to think of our world as a collection of related communities, of peoples separated and at the same time connected by our vast oceans and our great continents. All of us are interconnected, voluntarily or involuntarily, sharing our humanity, our terrible failings, but also our great potential for good, and of course, now our innate fragility on what is an ever more perilous planet. And speaking then as an islander, in a room of islanders, I believe that our experience as islanders defines us, not just in physical, geographical terms, but in the geography of mind, of our communities, our societies, our political outlooks, of how we see and relate to the world beyond our coastal horizons. And thus, Ireland finds it easy to understand the specific challenges that an island context and existence brings. Island life and proximity to the sea has historically created a special form of vulnerability of contact that has left island communities and low-lying coastal communities open to not only the forces of nature, but to the ravages of expansionist and acquisitive empires. And while some arrivals have been benign, many were of exploitative or dominating purpose. Many of the island nations that you represent, like our own, have learned through often and unrelenting harsh experience that what comes from foreign shores can be the source of danger and unwelcome attention. Today, the shared island experience is happening within a context of a financialized global economy with its specific pressures, threats that are now perilous from climate change and which are largely sourced in what are described as developed countries. Many of us have been the victims of colonialism and still carry its legacy and the challenges that it brings. But island peoples are now bearing new reconfigured versions of that legacy of colonization. This new circumstance has been recognized well and is borne out in valuable island insights, such as, for example, that of the Minister of Finance, Economic Planning, Sustainable Development and Information Technology in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Camilo M. Gonsalves. In his book, Globalized, Climatized, Stigmatized, his powerful demonstration as to how islands are inherently more vulnerable in a new set of challenges and economic environment is a presentation of issues that cannot be ignored and must be addressed. And I pause to congratulate St. Vincent and the Grenadines on their election last Friday, a very welcome one, here to the Security. In making reference to Minister Camilo Gonsalves' book, in facing these challenges to which he makes reference, I very strongly believe that a shared, concerted, determined strategy within the multilateral institutions and in diplomatic practice can be a vital tool. For one could not but be deeply moved by his clear, irrefutable presentation of the consequences of broken promises on the part of institutions in which nations had placed trust, of multilateral obligations avoided or commitments reduced to rhetoric. It cannot be denied that so much of our insatiable, accelerating and unregulated economic growth is primarily for the benefit of the North in development terms, and that this is at a wider level creating havoc and destruction through a climate change that is impacting on the lives of those who are the least contributors to our climate crisis, but who are its most proximate victims. Such a set of circumstances are sometimes presented as unavoidable, some kind of inevitable results of global markets over which control is impossible. Such a view, of course, when one thinks about it, sets democracy itself at global level into tension with the role of the market as a mechanism. It suggests a cage within which we are trapped as peoples. The multilateral voice must, as Gonsalves put it, be required to acknowledge that island states played little role in constructing the cage we now inhabit. I agree with this view. We must all, north and south of our shared vulnerable planet, muster the courage to free ourselves from the cage of those narrow assumptions of a destructively limited version of economics that has condemned us to such insufficient action. We must expose and oppose the obdurate continuation of what has been shown to be unsustainable. We must resist any evasion or quietism, for should we not respond, and with urgency and craft, we will be correctly regarded by future survivors on our planet as having been in collusion in the destruction of the lives and life worlds of some of the most vulnerable peoples of our human family and the biodiversity on which our planetary life in all its fullness depends. And island nations are of necessity, perhaps outward-looking, interested in the world beyond, in its promises and in its dangers, taking to sea. And yes, their culture emphasizes a warm welcome for stranger. This value placed on hospitality is understandable perhaps amongst people who are familiar with setting sail themselves across oceans to new destinations, of appreciating a welcome when they come ashore. And there is a realization among islanders, I believe, from their literature and lived experience that the world is something that is encountered, closer to us than our maps and charts might suggest, that what happens thousands of miles away will have its say much closer to home. As John Donne most famously put it 400 years ago about only one of the regions of our connected world. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clot be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. And of course it was 400 years ago, so therefore you could know the gender misuse is in fact it tells its own story. From such an insight comes a version of interdependency that is the very antithesis of any forced exploitative interconnection, be it historic or contemporary, be it of extractive industries, resources, or trade. Acknowledging such an interdependency creates an ethical, normative obligation on international policy and diplomatic practice. We are now interdependent and reliant on each other in a new way, one of not only a shared but a deeper vulnerability, as we are called upon to deal with the threats to the very future of life on our planet. We have undeniable impacts on each other's environments and communities, and we have an effect by our actions and practices on each other's capacities, not in any terms merely of human flourishing, but of possibilities for very existence itself. In reality, it might be useful at this point in human history for us not to consider ourselves, because we are islands or continental nations, as cut off by oceans from each other, but rather as sharing a fragile space as vulnerable inhabitants of island Earth, a global community that is struggling for the capacity to reflect on what we are leaving as legacy to future generations and make the changes that are necessary. For inaction is not an option. It will be a great failure if our response is to acquiesce with, or settle for, a resile to a rehearsal of old prejudices based on nationalities, religions, races, or of power and aggression. A much deeper sense of our common humanity, an invocation of hope and authentic commitment is needed if we are to create an engaged consciousness of the impact of our present policies and practices, such as will drive a global acknowledgement of our shared vulnerabilities, our kinship to each other in the common threats we face. If we are to achieve such a realization as might allow us to transcend all barriers and boundaries. Together, we have to repair the often broken and dysfunctional relationships that exist across lands and seas, the results of destructive social and economic practices that saw nature and resources that might have been for renewal as something that constituted an infinite mine for insatiable extraction. Our task is now so urgent, in light of the existential threat facing humankind, in terms of the climate change and biodiversity crisis, that it now requires a coordinated global response. And you have been having your important meetings, and we are all here today because we believe in our interconnectedness, in our closeness, not our distance from each other. We accept that we are bound together and that the often manipulated spaces between us are illusory, often a construct that is imposed and which is dwarfed relative to all that we share. What we share, experience, empathy, a common voice. As islanders, we should inherently understand and respond to the immutability of that which binds us. Our shared humanity must become our motivation for understanding and be our bulwark against the consequences of the destructive course on which we have seen released during, in particular, the past 3 centuries of the Anthropocene. A sense of justice, not only for now but for the future, requires that our residual sense of a shared humanity must be invoked to reconnect our lives through a balanced relationship between ecology, ethics, economy, culture, and lived experience. As head of state, as President of Ireland, who's been speaking of these topics, I realize how difficult it is to get a space for this discourse, how unhelpful it is for those who suggest that that which prevails at the present time is somehow our only mode of existence, this fractured life. And it is depressing that lessons from history, fundamental to coexistence on our planet, have not only been too often been forgotten or allowed to fade, but they are treated with a lazy disregard or are consciously hidden from us. They are so rarely present in the discourses or in even the very academies and institutions in which trust has been placed by populations for enlightened critical thought, pluralism, or method. There has to be a space, an agreed forum where we can transcend self-interest, engage with the other, and the United Nations has been our best effort at achieving such a space. The United Nations, whatever its shortcomings, has for more than 70 years been a beacon of values, a platform for us to come together, to share perspectives and principles. Our discourse, when we've had an opportunity of sharing our experiences with authenticity and respect for difference, has been able to be informed by hope, has sought to elevate the universal, sought to reject the false fragmentation of a common humanity. And such progress as has been made has been hard won. And I think any easy pursuit of our new issue should not be taken for granted as fixed. As in our time, a new Cold War rhetoric is renewed, and multilateral institutions are increasingly threatened and starved of resources. Unfortunately, today we see our very universality of commitment to sharing our response to our greatest challenges is under attack. We are experiencing a resile to narrow versions of sovereignty, extreme theories of interest in diplomacy, and rejections of previously agreed common purpose. Suggestions of shared sovereignty are often responded to with the pejorative suggestion that sharing sovereignty is somehow contrary to democracy. We can, of course, alternatively choose to share sovereignty and indeed deepen democracy. And our language itself is often corrupted. We are living with the consequences of what has been a concerted effort to make democracy and freedoms synonyms for an unrestrained, unregulated version of capitalism. And the will of the people has been defined grotesquely as some abstract, aggregated will of the insatiable person. Human rights, which have traditionally been correctly sourced, centered on the rights of the person that must be protected irrespective of religion, ethnicity, gender, or other categorizations used for so long to define our existence, are in a clear abuse of philosophical and moral principles, sometimes presented as somehow or another being inherently in opposition to wider social rights. A new agenda of eco-social, gendered political economy can be made to prevail if we are willing to work and unite for it. We have done so before, coming together for greater purpose. 2015 was a year of enormous significance for the United Nations and the people who are within its membership. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was agreed with a consensus of 193 nations under the United Stewardship and with the assistance, for example, of Ireland and Kenya, which, let us remind ourselves, was aimed at achieving nothing less than the transformation of our fossil fuel-dependent world by the year 2030. The Paris Climate Agreement similarly identified a pathway to protect our planet, mapping a way forward towards sustainability. These were landmark achievements, representing a vital step towards a sustainable future. And it is critical now that we do not allow these steps taken on this journey which the representatives of the people of the world undertook to falter almost before it has begun. Rather, instead, that we continue to work together as one global community that accepts responsibility for the future, that we renew our commitment to put in place a strong and unified global response to the threat of climate change. Within that unity, there can of course be a specific instrument, a unity of cooperating island voices at diplomatic level. That voice at the United Nations can be a shared resource, made more powerful by its collective strength and application, one that is resistant to any inducement to split apart. Yes, of course, there have been disappointments since 2015. The United States has signaled its highly regressive intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, which could take effect in November 2020. But we must remember that 195 UNFCCC members have signed the agreement, of which 185 have become party to it, member states representing some 85% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It is important, I believe, in making our renewed commitment to recognize and respond to the specific vulnerability which characterizes your islands and coastal communities' experience. Going back to Gonsalves again, he reminds us, there are 33 independent small island states that enjoy membership in the United Nations. Collectively, they are home to 40 million people and have a gross domestic product of $650 billion. These rough measures of financial weight, population and economic power point to a need for greater study, analysis and understanding of small island states as seen through their own eyes and the prism of their own unique circumstances or exceptional nature. May I therefore thank all of you gathered in this room this afternoon for your efforts in striving to sustain such an ambition. Small island developing states and low-lying coastal communities which you represent, I acknowledge, are giving leadership on the international stage in making sure that we will all deliver on our commitments and on our global responsibilities. And this then is the year in which we must move to our work on the implementation arrangements of the Paris Agreement. And may I assure you that Ireland stands with you in recognising the broader moral authority of small island developing states, whose very existence is threatened should we fail to respond collectively, as we work to build on the progress achieved since Paris in the climate summits held in Poland, Germany and Morocco. Ireland and the Marshall Islands will be co-chairing a session at the Climate Summit in New York this September. The Marshall Islands, of course, have played a significant role in highlighting the climate crisis, thanks to figures like the late Tony de Brum, the Marshall Islands minister and political activist, whom I had the great privilege of meeting and who sadly passed away almost 2 years ago. De Brum spoke with an impressive urgency and understandable passion on climate change, and he participated in numerous conferences and demonstrations, including the People's Climate March in New York City in September 2014. But to structure the process of identifying the transformational initiatives for the summit, 9 independent tracks have been defined. And I am delighted to inform you that the youth and mobilisation track will be led by the Marshall Islands and Ireland, with the support of the United Nations Secretary-General's Envoy on Youth, and will focus on mobilising youth and civil society in support of the UN Climate Summit in December, and will seek to achieve a significant youth participation across all tracks. For over 60 years at the United Nations, and for decades before attaining membership, Ireland has sought to speak with this resonant tone, first as a nation state taking its place among the nations of the world, but more recently with an assertiveness driven by the need to defend the value of building unanimity and respect, driven by the understanding that all voices must be respected, as the Charter assumes, as equal members, and stressing that often in the history of the United Nations, it has been in population terms the smallest voices, which have been the ones that have performed as disinterested partners in advancement of the common good. I suggest that the United Nations flourishes when such voices are heard and given prominence. And we also are called upon to be authentic. A United Nations that privileges the strong and neglects the weak betrays, after all, its own founding principles. A United Nations, for example, that confined the moral purpose of its charter to discussions and decisions at the General Assembly, and then went on ignoring such voices of the world to define its purpose narrowly, as being content with some under-labourer role of mediating the frequent abuses of the powerful on the Security Council. We together must all save the United Nations from such a fate of impotence. All of the initiatives I've spoken about are ones that can be taken at every level, including regionally. And for us here in Ireland, membership of the European Union has provided us with an opportunity to give voice to our global views. The European Union, born out of the ravages of war and conflict, we believe, has the opportunity to offer, including the assistance you might expect in defending, monitoring and sustaining your own legally acknowledged marine resources. There is a saying again in our own Irish language, Isar Scor Kela Waran Nanini. It means that we all live together in each other's shadow and in each other's shelter. And John Donne knew this, whom I've quoted earlier, for he concluded that poem, No Man is an Island, with the following lines. Again, I apologize for the gender in advance, but it was 400 years ago. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. And may I wish you all, fellow islanders, a further enjoyable and fruitful visit to our island. May it be both challenging and enriching and helpful to you in equal measure. And may you visit in future meetings, and we will have many, I hope, go on to develop and enhance the linkages between our island peoples as we continue to work together in playing a strong role as we tackle the enormous challenges of transformation that are facing us in the coming decades, but in which we can be successful if we work together with one voice. Garamila Mahaki, thank you.